Not too long ago, if you wanted to tell a story about injustice, a story about a crisis, or something about the world that people needed to hear, you needed a platform, a newspaper, a television network, or really any institution willing to give you the time and space to broadcast your message. But in this day and age, that's changed. Today, a 17-year-old kid with a phone and a point of view and a perspective can reach much more people in 48 hours than a journalist with a full editorial team that could have reached in a month 20 years ago. That shift didn't happen by accident. It happened because the tools have changed, and when the tools change, so do who gets to tell the story. So there has been a rather large shift from institutions to individuals, as most of modern history, storytelling was institutional, right? The press decided what was newsworthy, broadcasters decided what actually got airtime, and editors decide whose voice was actually worth amplifying and whose wasn't. And these barriers weren't just political, they were also logistical as cameras were expensive, right? Distribution requires infrastructure and general access required professional credentials and certifications. But what social media did and what short form video specifically did was break those barriers almost entirely. See, now you don't need a studio, an editor, or special permissions. But what you need is a relevant story and the ability to get your message across in under 60 seconds. The term 60 seconds here is referencing the idea that most social media platforms have a time limit on their short form content, with this time limit generally being around 60 seconds. Now, obviously, some platforms have the limits at 2 minutes or 5 minutes, but the key idea to take away is that this is all content or transfer of information that is relatively short form. Now, it's worth asking why short form specifically became the dominant format of youth storytelling. And the answer isn't only just in attention spans. So, short form forces discipline. When you have 60 seconds, you can't really afford filler. So, that means every word, every image, every second has to carry a purpose in your message. And that constraint produces clarity in a way that longer formats usually don't. And it also produces immediacy. So a 60-second video about a humanitarian crisis doesn't give the viewer time to step back and see what and from what they're seeing. The emotional response hits before their brain has a chance to process it rationally, and that's what exactly makes it powerful. And lastly, what's probably the most important is it's very easily shareable. So there's much less friction, of sharing a 60-second video with a friend than there is of sharing a 12-minute documentary and expecting the other person to watch it. The three dominant platforms for short form video in today's day and age is TikTok, Instagram slash Facebook Reels, and YouTube Shorts. So, and they're often treated as interchangeable. And while they have a ton of similarities, like the basis and the core and the concepts are the same, they're not exactly the same. So TikTok has the most aggressive discovery algorithm. So content from accounts with zero followers can reach millions of people if the engagement signals are strong enough. And this makes it uniquely powerful for new voices, which is especially an advantage for youth who may lack credibility or lack the followers to project their voice to a larger audience. And this is something that we'll talk about later. But Instagram Reels, on the other hand, operates within an existing social graph. So your content, when you post it, reaches people who either already follow you or people who are algorithmically similar to the content that you post. So maybe they follow other content creators that post similar content to you. So in general, it is more contained. And lastly, YouTube Shorts sits inside the world's largest search engine. So therefore, content is more likely to be discovered through intentional searching rather than just passively scrolling on YouTube Shorts. And this can be a disadvantage here because when you're trying to reach as many people as you can who are maybe uneducated on a specific matter, they aren't going to go search for something they're completely unaware of. So in that sense, it's a little bit unhelpful. And, as we can see, each platform commands a different approach, and understanding that difference allows us to separate strategic storytelling from just simply wasted effort. So we've established that the tools have shifted and who holds them has changed. But why does social media specifically work for humanitarian storytelling? and what makes it more effective than maybe traditional media for this kind of content. So there are three reasons: accessibility, algorithmic amplification, and emotional immediacy. So, accessibility. Social media is accessible in a way that traditional media is not, for both creators and audiences. So, for creators, the barrier to entry is simply a smartphone and an internet connection. And that's essentially nothing in this day and age. While for audiences, accessibility means reach. A story published on TikTok is theoretically available to anyone with the app, anywhere in the world, in any language, if the creator uses subtitles, obviously. And a story published in a regional newspaper, on the other hand, is not. This matters for humanitarian storytelling specifically because many of the crises that need telling are happening in places that traditional Western media doesn't cover or cover very limitedly. Social media can fill such a gap and inform a broader audience. So the second is algorithmic amplification, and this one is a little more complicated. So social media platforms are designed to maximize engagement. In speaking to a local journalist of the GTA, I learned that algorithms identify content that triggers strong emotional responses. And maybe that could be outrage, inspiration, empathy, shock. And the goal is to push it to a wider and wider audience. And for humanitarian storytelling, this can be extraordinarily powerful. A video documenting a crisis that might have reached a few thousand people through traditional channels can reach tens of millions if it triggers the right emotional response. But the same mechanism that amplifies important stories also amplifies misinformation, oversimplification, and exploitative content in general, right? The algorithm doesn't distinguish between a thoughtful, accurate account of a crisis and a misleading one. The only thing it focuses on is what generates engagement from the viewers and what doesn't. So this is why algorithmic amplification is a tool, but not necessarily a solution to the current issue of misinformation on the internet. Rather, it's a feeder into that issue. And because it amplifies whatever you give it, which is why what you give it is your responsibility. The third reason, and perhaps the most significant, is emotional immediacy. So, short form video is uniquely effective at producing an emotional response quickly. A 15-second clip of a child being displaced by conflict will generate more empathy than a 500-word article covering the exact same story. Not because the video contains more information, but because it bypasses the cognitive distance that the text creates. Now, this is not to say that publishing articles and writing papers is not impactful or good, as in many ways, they articles and papers can be much more impactful than a 30-second Instagram reel. But the important is understanding the difference between raising awareness and creating genuine impact. And that's something that we will cover later in the video. But and in speaking with several psychology majors in university, they claim to say that research consistently shows that people are far more likely to donate, share, or take action in response to an individual story than to just general aggregate data. So one person's experience moves us much more in a way than a million statistics do, right? Therefore, short form video exploits this, and probably in the best way possible, by centering the human experience at the very start. Right, this gives the audience much less time to disengage, which therefore creates an effective way of getting the message across. So, understanding why social media works allows us to plan and strategize our story in the best way possible so that it reaches the largest audience. Since youth are the ones who have grown up in this environment, they're the ones who will likely understand the strategy and intentions of content creation the deepest. So youth storytellers aren't just posting content and hoping for the best, but the most effective ones think carefully about the hooks, the visuals, hashtags, and timing. And they understand their platform, they understand their audience, and they understand that in a feed moving at hundreds of posts per minute, the first 2 seconds really decides whether someone is going to stay or scroll away. Every effective short form humanitarian story starts with a hook. A hook is whatever makes someone stop scrolling. It could be a provocative question, maybe a striking visual, an unexpected statement, but it's something that gets the viewer engaged and keeps them engaged. Now, youth creators have developed an intuitive understanding of hooks that many traditional journalists haven't. They've grown up as the consumers of the content, and they know from personal experience what stops them, and then they can thus apply that knowledge when they create content. Short form video is a visual medium, but it's also increasingly a sound medium, right? TikTok in particular is built around audio, right? So trending sounds, original audios, or voiceovers layered over footage. And youth creators have the best understanding of this as they pair emotionally resonant audios with carefully chosen visuals. And they know that the right combination of sound and image can create a specific and intentional tone compared to any other element alone. Hashtags are how short form content gets organized and discovered through the algorithm. Youth humanitarian storytellers use them deliberately, not just by adding generic tags, but identifying the specific communities and audiences that are most likely to engage with and amplify their content. They also build community, right? Comment sections, duets, stitches. These aren't just engagement metrics, but they're how stories get extended and enlarged and challenged. Right, a 60-second video can become a back and forth conversation through through other videos if it reaches the right community. So far we've talked about the mechanics, right? The platforms, the strategies, the tools, but the most important question is, does it actually work? Right? Does a 60-second video actually change anything? Does the awareness it creates translate to action? Does that awareness actually translate to impact? So to explore this, I wanted to look at two cases and then bring in a perspective from someone with direct experience in youth journalism. End SARS began as a hashtag which protested police brutality in Nigeria, specifically the Special Anti-Robbery Squad known as SARS, and which had been responsible for a widespread of human rights abuses. This included torture, unlawful arrests, extortion, and systemic brutality. The notorious police unit was also widely accused of illegally profiling and targeting young people based on their experiences. Now, what made it remarkable was the speed and method of its spread. Right, Nigerian youth used TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram to raise awareness and coordinate logistics by directing protesters to safe locations, live streaming police violence in real time, and creating documentary records of events that could not easily be suppressed. Short form video was central to this. Clips of police brutality spread rapidly. Eyewitness footage created a visual record that contradicted official narratives. The emotional immediacy of video, faces, voices, and real time violence drove international attention in a way that text based recording could not. The movement had true real world consequences. The Nigerian government officially disbanded SARS, international pressure mounted, and the story reached audiences that traditional media coverage in Nigerian politics rarely does. After the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, student survivors did something that previous generations of youth activists hadn't had the tools to do. They took control of their own narrative in real time. Using Twitter and Instagram and YouTube, Parkland students like Emma Gonzalez and David Hogue spoke directly to the public, bypassing traditional media gatekeepers, setting the agenda, and organizing what became one of the largest youth-led protests in American history. What distinguished this from previous youth activism was the sophistication of the media strategy. These students understood how short-form content caught people's attention. Their statements were quotable, shareable, and direct. They understood that in the digital environment, clarity in their story would provide them with the biggest advantage. March for Our Lives generated over 800,000 participants across the United States and catalyzed significant legislative conversations around gun control. Whether those conversations translated to lasting policy change is highly debated, but the capacity of youth storytelling is to set a national agenda was demonstrated clearly by this initiative, which should inspire others to do the same. Both of these cases raise questions that go beyond what statistics can answer, about credibility, about what impact really means, and about what it actually takes to tell these stories responsibly. So, to explore this further, I spoke with Aananya Bakshi, a student journalist with experience in youth media. I wanted to understand what effective and responsible youth storytelling actually looks like from the inside. So joining us today is Ananya from Ottawa, who goes to Colonel By Secondary School. So Ananya, tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your experience with journalism?
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me here today. And I'm incredibly happy to share some of my own insight as a student that is still learning from this incredibly vast field of journalism. But part of my experience has included raising awareness for youth mental health specifically by interviewing the Ontario's education minister all the way to receiving recognition from the Ottawa Carleton District School Board's research officer, but it is certainly a passion that I pair with my value for public health advocacy.
Thank you, Ananya, for that. It clearly shows that you have put a lot of work and have gained a lot of experience in the world of journalism. But nevertheless, let's hop right into the questions. So, firstly, does short form content create genuine impact or really just awareness? And what's the difference between the two?
Yeah, so when we talk about awareness versus impact, awareness is generally passive. So, yes, we do know that a problem exists, but impact is really when we're able to really create something tangible. And for an example, we can even change society's behavior. And short form content is really good at sparking that awareness, but it truly requires a structured bridge in order to translate that into clear impact. Now, as you may already know, before the internet actually existed, so many writers and journalists leveraged tools such as newspapers, magazines, or even broadcast media. And in today's time now, when we have digital platforms that are excellent at capturing the attention of youth, this doesn't necessarily offer any practical use to making our world a better place unless we leverage tools that help make that possible. So, yes, short form content is excellent in creating awareness, but it is really hard to use that to form impact. Now, in today's time, I've seen so many student leaders that are now pushing back on just posting reels on Instagram, for an example, and they're rather understanding that short form content can come in the form of publishing meaningful articles, for an example, that may raise awareness for healthcare conditions, let's just say. Now, for example, my role as the director for Neurominds, which is essentially a nonprofit whose mission is to including like raising awareness for neurological disorders, and there my position is to help mentor students leverage their journalistic abilities or even research capabilities in order to publish articles that raise awareness for these conditions, primarily to spark that importance of youth mental health. Now, I've also been inspired to engage in short form content by distributing pamphlets, bookmarks, or even posters as I served as a co chair for my school's Relay for Life event. And through that, I was able to raise awareness for PMOS. And that's essentially a disease that faces a lot of stigma, although so many women face it every single year. And it does increase the chances of acquiring endometrial cancer. So, in this context, the goal of my short form content here was to collect more donations and also build awareness for this condition all at the same time. So, overall, the best short form content is one that creates both impact and awareness while giving the viewers something tangible to do. So, in this case, it was collecting donations. Now, I'd also like to really highlight the trap of passive consumption Because short form media is exceptional at breaking down clinical barriers. For an example, as I mentioned with healthcare conditions, but it does risk creating this lack of opportunities that the viewer can do in order to achieve something tangible. So we don't want to create short form content where the viewer is just left with hitting the like button.
Absolutely. Those are some very valuable insights of, the difference between, actual storytelling and, the impacts it actually creates versus just creating awareness. Now, the next question I have for you is, what does responsible storytelling actually look like in practice for a young journalist such as yourself?
Yeah, that's definitely a question that I ponder on in my own day-to-day life as someone who is still aspiring as a journalist. But responsible storytelling, as far as my own experience concerns, really means refusing to oversimplify complex human or scientific realities for the sake of viral headlines or clickbait. And we know that the media often loves black or white stories. So we see headlines like social media is destroying youth brains, or kids are just overly sensitive and mental health is just overdiagnosed now. But there's not that middle gap. And I think it's really important to understand that true knowledge comes in the form of evaluating both the benefits and limitations of acquiring that knowledge. So, for an example, when I wrote my own piece for the Harvard Crimson Global Essay Competition, I made sure that my journalistic piece was unbiased. And I know that's like a huge responsibility for professional journalists out there today because you have to make sure that you're still captivating the reader or the viewer, but you're still remaining true to the morals of only presenting what is truly backed by evidence. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that you shy away from what's brutally honest. So, when I was writing another investigative journalistic piece, again on youth mental health, I interviewed level policymakers. So, for an example, like the Honorable Minister Calandra, who is the Ontario's Education Minister, as well as member of the Provincial Parliament, Mr. Fraser. Now, I had to include all of this evidence primarily for such a sensitive topic like youth mental health. Um, so, it's not necessarily a bad idea to include controversial information or opinions that clash with each other, but we just have to make sure that we're sticking with what's actually being presented through reliable institutions, and that as journalists, we can only present the opinions of others, but not those of ours. So, of course, the easy clickbait story would have been, an easy route for me to take, but the responsible story was certainly much harder to write. Of like really considering that I had to prove that institutional funding cliffs and academic competition was really what was causing, this academic stress on students and like this youth mental health crisis. But it was definitely specifically difficult for me because I was criticizing the very institutional frameworks that I'm currently in as a student. But it's definitely important that we understand that it's not that the right journalistic piece is will not necessarily be the easier one to write.
Absolutely. That is, those are some very good examples and frameworks of how responsibility and responsible storytelling actually come into play. And, a lot of that revolves around ethics and what is actually the ethical choice to make. In your opinion, what is the biggest ethical risk young storytellers face on social platforms, especially in today's era?
Yeah, when we talk about digital platforms, specifically social media nowadays, there's so many risks that that youth may face. But the biggest risk, to be quite frank, is the absolute monetization of the attention of youth today. And that's primarily because algorithms prioritize speed and emotion rather than accuracy of the knowledge that is presented. And these platforms are deliberately engineered around variable ratio reinforcement schedules. And that's something that I learned through my own research when I was investigating these algorithms. Now, the ethical risk really here is that young storytellers are incentivized to downregulate their own morals of presenting the truth in order to feed the algorithm's demand for outrage or shock or even strong emotions in the lookout for gaining more viewers. Now, I truly believe that if we want to change our society and if we want to break from this constant negative news that may also be, harming youth mental health, someone has to start prioritizing the truth over what people may want to accept as truth. Now, when you erase context in order to fit a format, that's when you start risking spreading misinformation under the guise of advocacy. And personally, I'm very fortunate to have found my passion for journalism under such credible institutions like Harvard Crimson and John Locke because they really instill the core values that are needed for journalism and for remaining tenacious in this digital era. But yeah.
You mentioned a lot of really credible institutions there, Harvard Crimson, John Locke, and I think credibility is it's probably one of the biggest frameworks of journalism. It will always be one of the biggest frameworks. You know, in your opinion and from your experience, how do you build credibility as a young storyteller? Especially when people might not really take you as seriously. And after all, you are young, you are, deemed to be inexperienced. How do you actually build that credibility?
Yeah, as a young individual that's still seeking out to make my mark in this field of journalism, I've learned that experience and more experience is the only way to truly gain that recognition. Now, similar to how we may see, like when parents find new schools for their children to go to, one of the primary things that they look for are teachers with, like numerous years of experience. So, similarly, in the digital world, when we have so many viewers and knowledge seekers, they're often on the search for knowledge from credible people, but also people with a lot of experience. Now, the only difference being is that in the digital world, there's a very fine line between what's good experience and what's bad experience. So, it's really easy nowadays for people to really mask themselves as credible. And we can see that in the name of popularity or even on social media platforms where we can see influencers. Now, the biggest challenge isn't even just gaining that experience, it's convincing people that the knowledge that you're presenting is verified from, credible institutions. But I am optimistic that now that we have so many tools in this digital era, people who do deserve to be taken seriously will definitely achieve more success now. And we even see these tools being implemented in schools, for an example. I still remember in my grade 10 civics class, we learned about the difference between misinformation and malinformation, and even how to identify that through websites. Now, I think it's also important for young journalists, especially to move away from this race of just collecting credentials, because we really need to focus on just creating that impact. Now, reputation will obviously naturally follow, but our goal should be to help make this world a better place. And while it is nice to say things like, I've gained recognition from Harvard Crimson, for an example, and I'm definitely really grateful for that to this day, but my main mission has always been to really gain people's trust and pursue my passion for advocating for the rights of students.
Absolutely. Thank you for your such valuable insight. It really shows that you're super passionate about journalism and you've gained so many different experiences through this passion. What you've given us here is a great role model and a great example of what responsible and impactful youth storytelling looks like. Thank you so much, Ananya. Ananya, we really appreciate it.
The pleasure is mine. Thank you so much for having me here today to talk about a topic that is so close to my heart.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, although Ananya gave us a breakdown of responsible storytelling, I want to offer a general framework of four principles that should guide any youth storyteller working in this space. So, the first C is context. Now, every story exists within a history. A 60-second video can't contain that history, but it can acknowledge it. The most responsible storytellers tell you the relevant and necessary background information so that misunderstandings and sidetracks don't occur, especially when subjects are sensitive in nature. The second C is credibility. So I want everyone to think to themselves before committing to telling a story. Are they the right person to tell this? Do they have the knowledge, the access, the relationships to tell this accurately and fairly from a neutral standpoint? Credibility isn't necessarily always about credentials. It's about whether your account can actually be trusted to its full extent. The third C is consent. So have the people in your story agreed to be there? Not just technically in a legal sense, but genuinely. Do they understand how the content will be used, who will see it, and what the consequences might be for them? I'll give you a personal example of this. So in producing this project, I reached out to several journalists across Canada for their perspectives, and several of them were, and many of them were uncomfortable having their opinions made public, and I understood why. For a working journalist, a public statement on a sensitive topic can have professional consequences that go far beyond anything I'd face as a student. Right? What I tried to do from the first email was be explicit, not just that their responses would be used in a video, but that their names and affiliations with their companies might appear alongside them. And there's no assumptions here, there's no fine print. It's just a clear and honest ask and full respect for whatever they decide to do at the end. And that's what genuine consent looks like. It's not just a checkbox. It's not just a disclaimer buried at the very end of an email, but it's an actual honest conversation about what you're asking and what their opinion and their words will be used for, and what that might mean for the person saying yes in this situation. So the last C is call to action. So what do you want your audience to do? That's the question that you want to ask yourself. A story without a call to action generates feelings, but not actual movement, right? The most effective humanitarian storytelling converts emotional engagement into concrete action. And this could be a donation, a signature, maybe a vote for an election. But at the end of the day, what actually moves the needle is concrete action and not just an emotional response. We are at an early moment in something that is going to define how humanitarian crises are understood and responded to for the next generation. The tools will keep evolving. AI generated content has already complicated questions of authenticity and credibility. Deepfakes exist, synthetic voices exist, and the line between documentation and fabrication is becoming harder and harder to draw. And in that kind of environment, credibility becomes the most valuable thing a storyteller can have. Here is what I've come to understand through this project. Platforms are not the point. Neither are algorithms, and neither is reach. The point is whether people trust you or not. Whether when they see your name attached to a story, they believe it. Whether your track record earns you the right to be heard. Platform reach can take a story from 0 to 1 million views overnight, but reputation is what determines whether that million views translates to people believing your story or dismissing it as a simple joke. Youth storytellers who are building towards that reputation now are committed to consistent, accurate, ethical, and human-centered work. They're building something that no algorithm can take away. Previous generations of young people who wanted to make the world a better place had limited tools for telling the stories that mattered. They could protest, write, and organize, but they couldn't reach the world directly. That's the difference between that generation and this one, and that's not a small thing at all. That's a profound shift in the distribution of communicative power, and with that power is a privilege that previous generations of youth activists didn't have. A 60-second video can reach millions of people. The real question is, how can we make that reach truly impactful for people's lives? That's the challenge, and it's yours.